Hello and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It's your host Weep Union, and let's get straight into why you clicked on this video. And this is the best performed Russian armored assault we have seen to date in this war. To explain it briefly before we enter into the footage, a Russian assault unit of about 6 armored vehicles move into and through the fields here to the southeast of Krasnohorivka, bypassing the Ukrainian fortifications, entering into the city of Krasnohorivka itself, moving through it where the tanks start shooting at Ukrainian positions in the buildings in the southeastern parts of Krasnohorivka, while at the same time infantry fighting vehicles are dropping off infantry. At the same time, only half of the vehicles go into the city, while the other half goes here to the western parts. The main push going into the city itself has multiple of the vehicles shooting at Ukrainian positions within the city while they were circling around in the area, dropping off infantry before pulling back out again. At the same time, the group going into the western direction drove down south, avoiding the residential areas, and drove back again after assaulting the Ukrainian positions there, where the two parts gathered up again to form a single file again before moving back into the battle where they were starting to hit the Ukrainian positions yet again. We will see the full video here. Starting out in the video, we see the 6 armored vehicles driving up by the Russian controlled areas and moving into the Ukrainian controlled areas by the forest area, where they're taking cover by the forest area to avoid direct fire by the Ukrainian ATGM units. Here we see the 2 units splitting up, with half of them driving across the railways going through the southern parts of Krasnohorivka and the other half going in the southern parts of the area. So we are following first the central parts, and then it goes back and forth as the UAV drone is single-handedly looking at both of them at the same time. They do not have an additional drone to split them up so that they can reconnaissance both at the same time. They're only looking at one at a time, switching between the two. When we see the ones within the city itself, we see the tanks driving into the central parts, back to the ones in the south, and then back into the central parts, where they start hitting Ukrainian positions in the buildings, blowing it up to bits with direct fire before driving around and returning, while we at the same time see the aftermath of the Russian assault to the south, where they were attacking the Ukrainian fortified lines and trenches to the south of the city before they all withdraw back. And we see that the Russians lose 2 armored vehicles only out of the 6, while they manage to gain positions within the city itself, as well as in the southern parts following this assault. With this, we see that this is probably the most successful Russian offensive since the start, and it doesn't just end there. They go back in after the first assault for a second assault, where they drive and focus on the southern parts due to the lack of success there. They send an additional wave to gain the success there, and we see them driving along the forest area again to avoid the direct fire from the ATGMs before moving on to the southern parts, where they have this large gap between each of the vehicles so that to avoid multiple tanks getting hit by this same shot. And with this, we see cluster munitions, artillery shells being used a lot against these tanks, yet we only see 2 armored losses by the Russians, and the Russians managed to drop off infantry in the southern parts as well. So with this, we see the Russians dropping off infantry both in the southern parts and in the central parts of the city, establishing themselves behind the Ukrainian positions. The map changes here are just theoretical. I'm not exactly sure whether or not they hold on to the positions in the central parts of the city and how much they have actually advanced in the southern parts. So this is up for being fixed. I'm pretty much going to be waiting for Syriac map to correct the map here, and then we will report on that when that is the case. Moving on to the next section of the front line, we see here in the north of Krasnohorivka, the Russians have advanced within Novokalinove, moving into and gaining a foothold within the eastern parts of the village. At the same time, the Ukrainians are launching counterattacks with their own infantry from the forest line to the east of the village. And this is exactly why I say that the Russians always look to secure their flanks, because otherwise this exact thing happens. So fighting is taking place here to the eastern parts of Novokalinove as the Russians are trying to establish themselves within the village, and the Ukrainians launch counterattacks to prevent that from happening. The Battle of Novokalinove itself is a battle to secure the flank ahead of a Russian assault towards Ocheretine. In the next section of the front line, we see here to the west of Bakhmut, there has been significant changes here in the direction of Jazov Yar. The Russians are now very close to capturing and fully gaining control of Bohdanivka. A year and 4 days after the first foothold was gained within the village, the Russians are now entering into the final battles where only 10% of the village is left under Ukrainian hands, and that would be the end of the Battle of Bohdanivka. Further south, the Russians have fully captured the forest line here to the southeast of Jazov Yar and gained a foothold in the forest area and captured the first trenches and fortifications of the Ukrainians here to the west of Ivanivsk. With this, the Russians are entering a general assault here to the southern parts of Jazov Yar to gain full control over the forest area and road here west of Ivanivsk, securing the area here to the south to gain a foothold across the canal line, as well as securing the eastern parts of the canal line. This will allow the Russians to flank the Jazov Yar positions from the south. And with the fighting in the north as well, the Russians are getting closer and closer to moving the battle into the canal itself. The battle taking place here in the direction of Jazov Yar is very intense, as the Russians are trying to gain full control over the eastern parts of the canal line. This is going in a pace of the number one priority, taking the flanks and the forest areas to the north and south of the eastern parts of Jazov Yar. Following that with control over the eastern parts, which will lead to full control over the canal line directly west of Bakhmut, after which it is likely that the Russians will focus on the southern and northern flanks by moving along the canal line, cutting off the Ukrainian positions from their supply lines. And while all of this is taking place, the Ukrainians have sent additional reinforcements to push back and counterattack against the Russian positions. This has led to the Russians intensifying their offensive operations elsewhere across the front, which is why we saw this armored assaults here in the direction of Krasnohorivka, as well as the recent advancements by Novomikhailivka in the southern parts of Donetsk, here to the north, where the Russians have started offensive operations in the direction of Novokalinove. And now we also see a further advance by the Russians here by Bilohorivka along the Chalk Hill. All of this is taking place as there are now a video released by the Russian Ministry of Defense as Russians are creating a long pontoon bridge across a long river. The video is out there, you can check it out for yourself, it is on my Telegram. But with this, we see that the Russians are definitely preparing for this massive scale offensive. At the same time, there are rumors going around that the Russians are definitely preparing a heavy offensive against Kharkiv. This is shown by both the Ukrainians heavily fortifying the city and the surrounding areas, building defensive lines ahead of this Russian offensive that they expect, and at the same time, the constant strikes on the energy grid of Kharkiv. It is likely that the city will eventually be completely without power, and no power means no work, no money, and no life. The Ukrainians within the city will definitely start a massive evacuation towards western Ukraine, west of Kharkiv and out of the city. This would leave a minimal amount of civilians in the city, which would make it much easier for the Russians to actually fight within it if they have to ignore the presence of civilians due to the lack of them actually being there. At the same time, we see that the Ukrainians are preparing this defensive line, which means that they are expecting a Russian strike there, and it is an obvious target both politically and militarily to attack Kharkiv by the Russians. So it is likely that a Russian offensive would definitely pass over Kharkiv, as they have an interest in capturing the city and gaining control of it. And that is all for this update. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. And make sure you have a great day.